and welcome to Inside Politics. I'm Anastasia Lavrina. On July 10, a pivotal meeting took place in Abu Dhabi between President of Azerbaijan Ilham Aliyev and Armenian Prime Minister Nikol Pashinyan. Their first face-to-face dialogue since the drafting of a peace treaty earlier this year. While no final agreement was signed, both leaders described the discussion as constructive, indicating that the foundation for continued negotiations has been firmly set. Abu Dhabi, serving as neutral ground, further underscores the global relevance of this process and the shifting dynamics in the South Caucasus. This meeting marks a move toward direct diplomacy, stepping away from traditional mediation by powers such as Russia, the United States, or the European Union. It reflects a wider regional recalibration. Azerbaijan, emboldened by its post-2020 position, and Armenia appearing increasingly open to a Western-oriented path. Key agenda items included border demarcation, post-conflict normalization and transport routes, especially the long-disputed Zangezur corridor, a project with significant geopolitical and economic weight. International reaction was cautiously optimistic. The European Union welcomed the meeting as a positive step and reaffirmed support for the March draft. So not at the table this time, the United States continues to show strategic interests. Washington supports regional initiatives that reduce Russian leverage while opening up new economic corridors. There is growing support for Western involvement in managing these routes, both commercially and in terms of security. The Kremlin, meanwhile, responded with a cautious approach. Russia's once dominant role in the region appears diminished as Yerevan and Baku increasingly engage on their own terms. And what does this all mean for global energy security and trade flows? More on this right now. I'm joined by John Roberts, energy security specialist at UK Methinks, and also our very own A News, Obey Shahbandar, who is joining from the United States of America. More welcome to Inside Politics.
Good afternoon.
Thank you very much for joining our discussion. And let me start with you, Mr. Roberts. If direct dialogue between Armenia and Azerbaijan proves to be more effective than previous mediation attempts, does this signal the end of traditional diplomacy where the major powers act as gatekeepers?
It certainly reduces the importance of the major powers, but I don't think it can be said to eliminate it completely. The first thing is that they have their own interests, and by and large, take the United States, its interests are for a peace negotiated between Azerbaijan and Armenia. The same goes for Turkey. It's not quite clear whether that is the same for Russia, although in the past it has espoused that view. But I think the practicality is that if you get an open trade route coming through the South Caucasus, partly through Azerbaijan and Georgia, partly through Azerbaijan and Armenia, you do strengthen what you might call Western commercial rules, ways of conducting business, and that in itself is of great importance to Western powers. So I don't think it's eliminated completely, but it is certainly reduced substantially.
Well, Ubey, the United States and the European Union have already expressed their support for peace efforts in the region. But as we have seen, these countries have failed to resolve the conflict between Armenia and Azerbaijan, let's say, in nearly 3 decades. Do these statements of support carry any real weight, or are they just attempts to reclaim influence that Russia has lost?
Well, that handshake between Prime Minister Pashinyan and President Aliyev in Abu Dhabi is certainly historic. And these talks between the two leaders are by far the most constructive and productive that have taken place between the two sides as the peace negotiations continue. So I think we are certainly at a pivotal point for the future geopolitical landscape of the South Caucasus. And I think it's very notable that that meeting, that historic meeting between Pashinyan and Aliyev, took place in Abu Dhabi, in the United Arab Emirates. It was not co-hosted by the Organization for Security Cooperation in Europe. It was not organized by the Russian government or any other institution or any other country, but seemingly in a neutral, friendly country that Abu Dhabi having very positive relations with Azerbaijan and with Armenia. So I think that is very notable. And of course, it was just earlier this week that Secretary of State Marco Rubio in the White House told President Trump that a peace deal is between Azerbaijan and Armenia would certainly have an impact. And of course, there is an American role to be played here, because if and when a historic peace deal is finalized between Azerbaijan and Armenia, that could lead to a new chapter of bilateral relations between the United States and Azerbaijan. Of course, that bilateral relationship during the Biden administration certainly suffered a great deal, with many officials in Baku believing the Biden administration had played an unfavorable role and was favoring one side over another. Now, with the Trump administration in power here in Washington, there is a chance for a new age of American-Azerbaijani relations within the context of a peace deal with Armenia that would also lead to full normalization between Armenia and Turkey. And of course, that would open up Western trade routes to Armenia for the first time, especially once that Zangezur corridor, which for our viewers back home, that is a rail and road corridor that would go through Azerbaijan, Karabakh territory, and then through the southern part of Armenia, and then connecting to that exclave of Nakhchivan and into Turkey. So that would be a major east-west trading route that could be used to connect the world while bypassing Iranian and bypassing Russian territory. So there's certainly a great deal of economic and geopolitical interest in that east-west corridor. What role will Washington play to finalize that peace deal? That remains to be seen, but I think it is very significant that Secretary of State brought these negotiations up to the forefront in the White House to President Trump earlier this week. Of course, the incentives here could be trade deals between the U.S. and Azerbaijan and Armenia that could help push this deal and finalize it. But certainly, this used to be the backyard of Russia. And at some point, the Russian leader, Vladimir Putin, had said that no deal could ever be reached in the South Caucasus without Russian intervention. And now we are seeing the two countries negotiating directly, meeting in Abu Dhabi, certainly a signal that the old processes, whether through international organizations or through Russia or through European mediators, was not working. And now the two countries are as close as ever.
Very interesting, Ube. You touched a very important point, and I would like Mr. Roberts also to know your opinion about this. Do you believe that the powers like the United States of America, the European Union itself, or Russian Federation can play any kind of role in the process of negotiations? In the future, when the peace deal is signed, probably there is a place for the global powers, but now at this stage, if there is anything the global powers can still do?
You phrased it exactly rightly. The question is the difference between what they can do now and what might happen following a peace settlement. I do not think there is much role for either the EU or the United States to play, other than to support, in effect, whatever Azerbaijan and Armenia are prepared to agree between themselves. If there is any power that can play a role before the peace settlement, it would be Turkey. Turkey has direct interests. It has a significant economic presence and indeed security presence in the region. It also would like to have peace on its border. So I think you may well see the Turks play some kind of a role, particularly as we seem to have reached a stage where Azerbaijan and Armenia both say, look, we're on the road to a peace settlement, but we haven't quite got there yet. So that means there must be some kind of stumbling blocks. And if there are, then Turkey is perhaps the best placed outside power to try to help remove them.
So that's a very important issue now, Obi. We have seen the statements, as I already mentioned, from the US officials supporting peace and connectivity. But is there a clear, coherent Western strategy in the South Caucasus, or it's more the reactive approach? And coming back to what Mr. Roberts already said, the cooperation with Turkey, I do remember the programs we discussed with you, how the new administration in the White House can closely work with Turkey in order to deal with the issues related to the South Caucasus, Russia, Ukraine, or the Syria post-conflict recovery. Therefore, where do you see two countries can work closely in regards to the South Caucasus?
Well, I think that given that we are seeing a new stage of bilateral relations between Washington and Ankara, with President Trump having a very positive and working and constructive relationship with President Erdogan, and with the American ambassador to Turkey, Tom Barak, playing a very active role. Of course, Tom Barak also serving as President Trump's special envoy to Syria, where the U.S. has said they want to work closely with Turkey to ensure its stabilization, and Azerbaijan also playing a role on that front to support, stability in the Middle East. So I think that this new age of cooperation between America and Turkey is certainly very relevant here when we talk about the South Caucasus and the future of the South Caucasus, given, of course, that Turkey and Azerbaijan are treaty allies, are strategic partners. That any deal Armenia is really a trilateral deal that would allow, once a peace deal is finalized, for Armenia to finally fully open its border with Turkey, and Turkey to allow Armenian transport of goods to the West. Currently, Armenia is completely landlocked. It is only participating in a north-south corridor of trade because of its geopolitical situation. If a normalization, full normalization is reached between Armenia, Azerbaijan, and Turkey, that would open Armenia's market to the rest of the world. And I think that's where the United States can come into play, where the Trump administration is to continue its constructive cooperation with Turkey on NATO, on Syria, on Black Sea security, and that any future Trump policy on the South Caucasus will be through that prism. But I think certainly the Trump administration, given the fact that they are interested in expanding the Abraham Accords, that historic peace accords in the Middle East, and that they want to bring more countries into that fold, that Azerbaijan could perhaps play a constructive role in expanding the Abraham Accords, given its special relationship with Israel and with positive relations with other countries in the Middle East. And this could perhaps, given President Trump's personal relationship with President Erdogan and President Erdogan's strategic alliance with President Aliyev of Azerbaijan, I think this could lead to perhaps a trilateral American, Turkey, Azerbaijan cooperation in the South Caucasus once that peace deal is signed. How important of a role will Washington play in finalizing that deal? I think perhaps at the final stages of those negotiations, right before a deal can be signed, you will probably see phone calls between President Trump of Armenia's leader and Azerbaijan's president. Perhaps that's one scenario. And certainly, again, for President Trump, diplomacy is all bilateral trade, opening businesses, the biggest economy in the world, countries. So that could be another carrot, another incentive, a deal to be finalized between Azerbaijan and Armenia. But certainly, I think that America will have more of a role, perhaps in the South Caucasus, if this deal is signed, given the expanding cooperation and positive relations between the United States and Turkey.
Mr. Roberts, let's talk more in details about the energy transit routes here in the region of the South Caucasus, with Russia's influence appears to be diminishing in the region. How does the process between Armenia and Azerbaijan, the normalization of the relations, can reshape the energy policy in the region, especially because Ubay previously mentioned that Armenia has a chance, after signing of the peace deal with Azerbaijan, to join the world market? I guess first of all we have to think about the energy connections, but also about the transport connectivity in the region.
I don't think there's much in terms of energy connections that will change. The international routes for getting oil and gas out of Azerbaijan to commercial markets via Georgia and Turkey are well established. And the sheer cost of building, for instance, new oil or gas lines through Armenia, even though they would be shorter, make little point at this stage. But there is something in energy that I think is worthwhile. If there is peace, then both Armenia and Azerbaijan become better places in which to invest. Now, from an Azerbaijani perspective, one of the issues is that their oil is at best at plateau and more probably actually in a state of decline. So that means you need fresh investment in the exploration and production of prospects that have already been identified but not yet drilled. So a company like Exxon would naturally be interested. It has had long ties and involvement in Azerbaijani energy, but I think it's a kind of marginal investment that just gets that little bit better at a time of peace. With regard to Armenia, the real question is, what do you do about the nuclear reactor? At what point do you start getting a replacement for that reactor? And at what point do you start thinking, what kind of energy can Armenia produce? And the slightly smaller but still interesting perspective that 15 years ago or so, the deputy foreign ministers of both Armenia and Azerbaijan said that if there were to be peace, then they would be happy for Azerbaijani oil and gas to go into Armenia, and Armenia's deputy foreign minister said they'd be happy to receive it. So I think you get a strengthening of regional energy ties, but I don't really think you get a massive change in how Azerbaijan exports its fossil fuel energy. What might be new, and I use the word might very carefully, would be if the Zanzibar corridor opens up and becomes, in effect, a way for Azerbaijan to transit Armenia as a shortcut through both the Nakhchivan and, above all, to Turkey, then under those circumstances, export of renewable energy from the Karabakh into Turkey might well be really possible and productive. But that's still quite some way away, and it's clearly dependent on a peace treaty and a better idea as to just what would be involved in creating the Zanzibar corridor.
So that's a great point you made, Mr. Roberts. So I guess here we also have to cover the topic of Armenian energy security. Mr. Roberts rightly mentioned Metsamor nuclear power station, which is quite old and require the new developments, infrastructure, or some experts even think about it has to be closed in near future. I do remember the time when European Union even offered special compensation to Armenian government in case they agree to close the station and work on probably renewables or any type of energy diversification. So how do you think the peace deal with Azerbaijan can help Armenia to deal with this issue in the future? And do you believe that any outside country, the European Union, United States, Turkey, is ready to work with Armenia in this particular issue without peace deal signed with Azerbaijan?
Well, historically,
done without a settlement.
Well, Ubey, do you agree with this point?
Well, historically, one of the great benefits of a peace deal is that not only does it end conflict, but it is a massive boon, a massive catalyst for international direct investment. Investors love stability. And a peace deal between Azerbaijan and Armenia will mean more international investment in Armenia, more bilateral trade between Armenia and Azerbaijan, which will be massively beneficial for Armenia, which right now completely depends essentially on only two countries, Russia and Iran. So within that context, once all that revenue, all that capital starts flowing into your country that you didn't have before, that opens up all sorts of other possibilities for reconstruction. And it opens up the possibility of perhaps you need to upgrade your nuclear reactor. Well, now you have more than one choice, which was essentially Russia. And having more choices and more options for trade, for investment, is generally a good thing for any country. And going back real quick to Azerbaijan and its energy outlook, look, the fact that this negotiations between Azerbaijan and Armenia are so close to being finalized at a time when British Petroleum is in talks with Shell for a potential merger, I think is also very significant. Again, this, with high European demand for Baku's natural gas exports through the European Southern Corridor at a peak, Azerbaijan needs more investment to expand its oil and gas exports. And I think a peace deal, once those signatures are on that document, will be beneficial economically to Azerbaijan, to Armenia, and for foreign direct investment to both countries.
Well,
I think there's another point that could be made here. That is the role of the United States, because the European Union is far more worried about the development of fossil fuels. The European Investment Bank already does not allow investment in fossil fuel in its infrastructure. The EBRD may yet follow suit. And that inhibits the growth and expansion of the Southern Gas Corridor. But of course, the United States is not in that position, and the Southern Gas Corridor's biggest requirement for expansion is new compressors, and it's American companies that make those compressors. So therefore, there is a scope for increased American exports in the event of a peace deal. And there's something for Armenia here at this stage as well, which is the Armenian diaspora. It's done well in the United States. It's done very well. It's prominent. It's been extremely active, as we know, politically. But it's also been active economically. And if you have an Armenia that is no longer an isolated island, but is a state that is open to trade with most of its neighbors, including, above all, I would say, Turkey, but also Georgia, we know already, and Azerbaijan, it becomes a good place for investment, or you might say repatriated investment. And if you want an extreme example of how that can be done, well, there's Israel. I wonder just whether Armenia might be able, just a little bit, to replicate some of what Israel has done in terms of attracting external finance from its own communities elsewhere in the world.
Mr. Roberts, one more question I have. You mentioned Armenian diaspora that's quite powerful in some European states and Russia, and some of them are not in favor of signing any peace deal with Azerbaijan. But on the other side, we have the Prime Minister who are coming to Abu Dhabi, meeting with President Aliyev and discussing the future peace deal to be signed between the two countries. One of the key elements discussed at the meeting was the trust, to overcome the mistrust existed within the decades. So one, I would say, even rhetoric question, but still very important. Given the historical complexity of the conflict between two countries, do you think a peace deal is truly achievable in near future, and what you think two sides should work on to make it happen?
First of all, yes, I do think it's achievable. I think that they're going to have to work out the Zanzibar corridor in particular on the basis that it has to be absolute Armenian sovereignty over it. The question is, what kind of routine rights could Azerbaijan expect to get to use it for transit? But I'll make another point about the diaspora, if I may. By and large, expatriates, the heirs to previous generations of refugees have gone abroad. They have deeper roots to older concepts. What happens in their home countries often takes time to filter through to them. If you want to look at who were the biggest supporters of the IRA in Northern Ireland, it was the North American Committee. Why? At a time when the Republic of Ireland, which one would have thought instinctively wants to have a union of North Ireland and the Republic, had proclaimed the IRA to be outlaws. If you said that to someone who called themselves an Irish American, quite frankly, they would not believe you. What are you saying? The IRA are considered outlaws by Dublin? What kind of people are there in Dublin? It is extraordinarily difficult for people who have grown up with a mythology and an image of what the condition was in the past to accept that what happens on the ground in their old home country is often very, very different, and that people's opinion on the ground is very different. That's why I would hope that President Aliyev and Prime Minister Pashinyan really do reflect contemporary thinking in their countries, even though they also have to propel that thinking along the avenue of peace.
So let's see how the situation will be developed in the near future. But now, dear experts, thank you for joining our program today.
Thank you.
Well, as we have seen, the South Caucasus is no longer just a regional matter. It has become a reflection of a larger transformation in global diplomacy, with traditional powers losing ground and new players stepping in. The path to peace between Armenia and Azerbaijan is being redrawn in real time, without old intermediaries and on new terms. We'll continue to follow this story closely, because what happens at the crossroads of East and West matters far beyond its borders. I'm Anastasia Lavrina. Thank you for watching Inside Politics. Stay with us for more analysis, more clarity, and more context right here. See you soon.